The moment Catherine Bristol stepped off the stagecoach in Harlow Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1879, she told the driver, the station master, and anyone else within earshot the same thing she had been saying for 3 months and 4 towns running, that she was just passing through. The dust had barely settled around her boots when the words left her lips, clear and deliberate, as if she were reciting something she had memorized from a page. The station master, a round-bellied man named Harold Pitts, nodded politely and pointed her toward the only boarding house in town. The stagecoach driver tipped his hat and didn't say much at all. But the man leaning against the post of the general store across the dirt road, arms folded and hat pulled low against the afternoon sun, heard her just fine, and he smiled the kind of smile that meant he had already formed an opinion. His name was Seth Atkins, and he had lived in Harlow Creek his entire 28 years on this earth. He pushed off from the post, crossed the street at a leisurely pace that suggested he was in no particular hurry, and stopped just close enough to be heard without shouting. He had dark hair that curled slightly at the ends where sweat had gotten to it, and eyes that were an unusual shade of amber that caught the light when he tilted his face. He wore the clothes of a working man, worn leather boots, a faded blue shirt rolled to the elbows, and a belt with a simple silver buckle. He was not flashy. He was not trying to impress anyone. He simply walked over and said, with complete and unashamed confidence, "I will bet against that." Catherine turned to look at him the way one looks at something unexpected and mildly irritating. She was 25 years old, with dark auburn hair she kept in a practical braid, and green eyes that had a particular sharpness to them, the kind that came from spending the last 2 years learning exactly who she was not going to trust. She wore a deep blue traveling dress that had seen better days, and she carried a single leather bag that contained everything she owned. "Excuse me," she said. "I said I will bet against that, against you just passing through." He said it without arrogance, which somehow made it worse. He said it the way a man says something he genuinely believes. Nobody just passes through Harlow Creek. There is nothing on the other side of Harlow Creek but 60 miles of hard country and the Pecos River. So wherever you were headed, this is likely it. Catherine stared at him for a moment. "I was not asking for your geography lesson." "No," he agreed, and his smile did not waver. "You were not." "I am Seth Atkins. My family runs the Atkins cattle ranch just east of town. Welcome to Harlow Creek, Miss Bristol," she said, after a pause that made it clear she was deciding whether to tell him. "Catherine Bristol, and I appreciate the welcome, but I do not intend to stay." "Yes, ma'am," he said, as if that settled nothing at all. She picked up her bag, gave him one last assessing look, and walked toward the boarding house that Harold Pitts had pointed her toward. Seth Atkins watched her go with his arms folded again, his expression thoughtful and quietly pleased, the way a man looks when he has just accepted a bet he is absolutely certain he is going to win. The boarding house was run by a widow named Mrs. Pearl Hensley, who was somewhere between 55 and 70, and refused to discuss the matter. She was a compact woman with silver hair and opinions about everything, and she made it plain from the first moment that her boarding house ran on 3 rules. You paid on time, you were quiet after 9 in the evening, and you ate what she cooked without complaint. Catherine agreed to all 3 without hesitation, and was shown to a small but clean room on the 2nd floor with a window that faced east, toward the flat Texas plains that stretched out like a bleached table under the vast sky. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and looked at her hands. Her story was not a complicated one, though it had left its marks. She had grown up in Richmond, Virginia, in a family that had survived the war with their house intact and their pride largely destroyed. Her father had been a good man in the way that meant he was good to his friends and indifferent to his responsibilities. Her mother had managed everything quietly until the day she simply stopped managing it, taking to her bed with a cough that lasted 3 winters and finally took her. Catherine had been 22 when her mother died, 23 when her father remarried a woman who made no secret of how inconvenient she found a grown stepdaughter, and 24 when Catherine had packed what she could carry and boarded the first westbound train she could afford. She had not been running exactly. She had been moving towards something, though she had not yet worked out what it was. She had stopped in Memphis for a month, working as a seamstress. She had spent 6 weeks in Little Rock doing bookkeeping for a dry goods merchant who turned out to be dishonest, which had prompted another departure. She had made it as far as Fort Worth before the money ran thin, and the stagecoach line had offered her a discounted fare in exchange for helping a family with 4 young children manage the journey west. And so she had arrived in Harlow Creek. She told herself it was temporary, not because she had somewhere else to be, but because committing to a place felt like the kind of thing that could be taken from you, and she had learned that lesson well enough. The next morning, she rose early and walked the length of the town's main street, which took about 10 minutes, and revealed everything Harlow Creek had to offer. There was the general store, the saloon, the blacksmith, a small church painted white with a crooked cross on top, the land office, the barber shop, the stagecoach station, and Mrs. Hensley's boarding house. There was also a doctor's office belonging to a man named Dr. Elias Prout, who appeared to be approximately 100 years old and practiced medicine with the confidence of someone who had outlived most of his mistakes. Behind the main street were perhaps 40 or 50 houses and the schoolhouse, and beyond that, the open country that swallowed everything. She was studying the notice board outside the land office when Seth Atkins appeared again, this time on horseback, leading a second horse by a rope. He pulled up alongside the hitching post and tipped his hat. "Miss Bristol, you find everything you needed. I am looking for work," she said directly, because she was not a woman who believed in unnecessary preamble. "Do you know if anyone in town is hiring?" He swung down from the saddle in one easy motion and tied his horse before answering. "What kind of work?" "Bookkeeping primarily. I can also sew, teach, and cook tolerably well, though I prefer not to make that my primary occupation." He considered this seriously, which she appreciated. He did not dismiss it or tell her she ought to find herself a husband, which was what the last 3 men she had asked for work advice had told her. Hank Garfield over at the general store has been keeping his own books since his wife passed last year, and he is doing a poor job of it by all accounts. The schoolteacher position is also open. Miss Walters got married in February and moved to El Paso. He paused. There is also the land office. Tom Briggs runs it mostly himself, but the county has been pushing him to keep better records of the new homestead claims coming in, and he has been complaining about it to anyone who will listen. Catherine felt something loosen slightly in her chest. 3 possibilities, she said. That is more than I expected. Harlow Creek is growing, Seth said. More families coming in along the cattle routes. It is not a bad place. He said it simply, without salesmanship, as if he were stating a fact about the weather. You said that yesterday, essentially. I meant it yesterday. Still mean it today. He picked up the rope attached to the second horse. I am riding out to the eastern pasture if you need anything else, but you are welcome to walk into any of those 3 places and tell them Seth Atkins sent you. It will not hurt. She wanted to tell him she did not need his name to open doors for her, but the practical part of her recognized that in a small town in 1879, knowing someone was often the difference between being taken seriously and being dismissed, and she was tired of being dismissed. "Thank you," she said, and meant it as plainly as he had meant his other statements. He nodded, swung back up into the saddle, and rode east without looking back. She got the bookkeeping work at the general store within an hour. Hank Garfield was a tall, lean man with enormous hands and the expression of someone perpetually surprised by events, and he had been so clearly desperate to have someone else manage his ledgers that he had agreed to her rate without negotiation. She started that same afternoon, settling at the small desk in the back room behind the counter, surrounded by towers of receipts and invoices that Hank had arranged in a system that appeared to be based entirely on which pile was closest to his right hand. It took her 4 days to bring the books into order, and by the end of those 4 days, Hank Garfield had told her 3 times that she was the most capable person who had set foot in his store since 1874, which she suspected was also the last time someone had organized his finances. The town grew around her the way towns do when you are not paying attention. She learned names without trying: old Pete Norris, who sat outside the barbershop every morning like a fixture; the 2 Gallagher brothers who ran the blacksmith and argued constantly but never seriously; young Tommy Briggs, who was the land office man's nephew, and who was learning the trade with the enthusiasm of someone who actually loved paperwork, which Catherine found endearing. She learned that Dr. Prout was not actually as ancient as he appeared, but simply moved that way due to a hip that had been bothering him since a horse rolled on him in 1861. She learned that the saloon, which was called the Red Rock, was managed by a woman named Dolores Vega, a Mexican woman of perhaps 40 who ran her establishment with an iron efficiency and an absolute refusal to tolerate disrespect toward her girls, which Catherine found enormously admirable. She also learned more about Seth Atkins, though she told herself she was not specifically looking for the information. The Atkins Ranch had been established by his father, James Atkins, who had come to Texas from Missouri in 1852 and built everything from the ground up. James Atkins had passed in 1876 from a fever, leaving the ranch to Seth, who was the eldest, and his younger sister, Ruth, who was 18 and had recently married a young farmer named Charlie Dunning. Seth ran the ranch with a crew of 4 hands, managed approximately 400 cattle, and was known throughout the county as a man whose word meant something, which in the Texas of 1879 was not a small thing. He was also unmarried, which the women of Harlow Creek appeared to find either hopeful or baffling, depending on their own circumstances. She encountered him regularly, because in a town the size of Harlow Creek, encountering people regularly was unavoidable. He came into the general store 2 or 3 times a week for supplies, and he always stopped to exchange a few words with her, never more than she seemed to want, never less than was civil. He was consistent in a way she had not expected, and consistency was, she was beginning to realize, the quality she found most disarming in a person. One evening in early May, 3 weeks after her arrival, there was a dance at the church hall. Mrs. Hensley informed her about it over supper the night before with the tone of someone announcing a civic duty. "Everyone goes," Mrs. Hensley said. "It is a spring social. Reverend Dalton organizes it every year. You should go, dear. It will do you good to meet people properly." "I have met people," Catherine said. "You have met them in a professional capacity," Mrs. Hensley said, in the way of someone who understood the difference perfectly. "That is not the same thing." Catherine went to the dance partly because Mrs. Hensley was correct, and partly because it was a Friday evening and the alternative was sitting in her room reading the same 3 books she had brought with her, which she had already each read twice. The church hall had been decorated with lanterns and spring flowers, and there was a fiddle player named Caleb who also played harmonica simultaneously when the mood struck him, and a guitarist who turned out to be Tommy Briggs, the land office nephew, who was apparently better with a guitar than he was with a land deed. The music was lively and the dancing was enthusiastic, and Catherine stood near the side of the room with a glass of lemonade, watching with a feeling that was not quite loneliness but was adjacent to it. Seth Atkins appeared beside her without fanfare, also with a glass of lemonade, and stood quietly for a moment watching the dancing. "You are not dancing," he observed. "No one has asked me," she said, which was true. She had been there 20 minutes and the men in the room seemed uncertain how to approach her, which she attributed partly to the fact that she had a face that did not naturally invite casual conversation, something her mother had called a reserved expression and her stepmother had called unfriendly. "I am asking," Seth said. He turned to look at her directly. "Would you like to dance, Miss Bristol?" She looked at him. He was wearing a clean shirt which was dark green, and his hair was combed, and he was looking at her with that steady amber gaze that she had noticed never quite looked away the way most people's did when they got nervous. "Yes," she said, which surprised her slightly. "I think I would." He was a competent dancer, not elegant but solid and certain of the rhythm, which made it easy to follow him. They danced 2 songs before she said, slightly breathless from the pace, "You know, most people would have given up by now." He looked at her curiously. "Given up on what?" "On convincing me that Harlow Creek is worth staying in." "I have not been trying to convince you," he said. "I have just been being polite." "Have you?" He smiled, and it reached his eyes this time in a way that shifted something in his expression, made it warmer and more open. "Mostly," he admitted, "though I will confess I still believe I am going to win that bet." "What bet?" "You made a declaration. I did not agree to any bet." "You did not have to agree. It is a bet I made with myself." She laughed genuinely, which she had not done in a while. It was a real laugh, not the polite kind she had been dispensing like small change since she arrived. It surprised both of them, and for a moment they simply looked at each other while the fiddle played on around them. "You are very peculiar," she told him. "So I have been told," he said comfortably. "Dance another one with me?" She did. By the end of May, Catherine had taken on the schoolteacher position as well, which doubled her income and gave her something she had not expected to want, which was purpose. The school had 14 students ranging in age from 6 to 15, and they were a mixed group in every sense. The children of ranchers, the children of homesteaders, one child whose father was a Mexican vaquero working for the Atkins ranch, and 2 children of a black family named the Walkers who had settled on a small piece of land west of town and farmed it with determined patience, despite the fact that not everyone in Harlow Creek had made them feel welcome. This last thing troubled Catherine in a way she did not keep quiet about. She made sure the Walker children, James, who was 9, and Clara, who was 12, sat with the same dignity as any other student and were called on with the same frequency and patience. She noticed that some parents had opinions about this, and she noticed equally that she did not particularly care. One afternoon, after school let out, she was still at the schoolhouse organizing the following week's lessons when Seth appeared at the door, hat in hand. He had apparently spoken to young James Walker's mother about something related to her husband's work on the ranch, and he had stopped by on his way back through town. He looked at the lesson plan spread across her desk and said, "You take this seriously." "I take everything seriously," she said without looking up. "Sit down if you want to talk or leave me to work. I'm happy with either." He sat down in one of the student chairs with his long legs folded awkwardly, and she smiled despite herself at the image of this large, capable man wedged into a chair designed for a 10-year-old. "Do you like it?" he asked. "Teaching?" She considered the question honestly. "I did not expect to. I thought I would find it exhausting. But there is something remarkable about watching a child understand something they did not understand before, like a lamp being lit." She glanced up. "Is that sentimental?" "No," he said. "It sounds true." She set down her pen. "James Walker is one of the sharpest students I have. He is reading above his level, and he has a mind for numbers that would put most grown men to shame. But people look at him and make assumptions before he opens his mouth." She said it quietly but firmly. "It makes me angry." "It should," Seth said. He said it without hesitation or qualification, and she looked at him more carefully. "Your ranch," she said, "you employ Joseph Walker." "Best hand I have got," he said simply. "Has been for 2 years. I pay him the same rate as the others, which is not something every rancher around here can say about their hands who are not white. I'm not telling you that to impress you. I am telling you because you seem to want to know what kind of man I am." She held his gaze for a long moment. "I did want to know that," she admitted. "And I have not decided yet," she said, and picked up her pen again. But she had begun to decide. She was simply not ready to say so. June arrived with the kind of heat that settled over the Texas plain like a physical weight, and the town moved through it with the resigned efficiency of people who had been living with Texas summers their whole lives. Catherine learned to walk in the shade, to drink more water than she thought she needed, and to appreciate the hour just before sunset when the temperature dropped enough to breathe fully. She and Seth had fallen into a habit that neither of them had formally established. 3 or 4 evenings a week, after she had finished at the school and he had come back from the ranch, they would find themselves at the same end of town, and they would walk. Not always together, but often enough that people in Harlow Creek had begun to notice. And noticing in a small town meant talking, and talking meant that Mrs. Hensley knew about it before Catherine had made any decisions about how she herself felt. "He is a good man," Mrs. Hensley said one evening, with the casual precision of someone dropping a stone into water and waiting to see the ripples. "He is a pleasant neighbor," Catherine said. Mrs. Hensley made a sound that communicated her view of this assessment without requiring words. The evening that changed things was a Thursday in mid-June. A summer storm had been building all day on the western horizon, the kind of purple-black wall of cloud that rolled in off the plains with the slow certainty of something inevitable. Catherine had dismissed school early and was walking back from locking up the schoolhouse when the first serious drops began to fall, fat and cold and shocking after the heat of the day. She ran for the overhang in front of the general store, which was the closest shelter, and arrived at approximately the same moment Seth Atkins rode in from the east at a canter, his horse darkening quickly in the rain. He tied up quickly under the same overhang and came up beside her, shaking water from his hat, breathing hard from the ride. "You all right?" he asked, looking at her with the kind of immediate concern that had nothing performative in it. "Wet," she said, "but otherwise intact." He laughed, and then the rain truly began in earnest, sheeting down in gray curtains that turned the street to mud in minutes and made the world beyond the overhang into something gray and soft and entirely separate. Lightning walked across the southern sky, and thunder followed it, deep and rolling, and the two of them stood close together under the narrow shelter watching it with the particular intimacy that storms create between people who are already in the process of becoming important to each other. "I never told you what I was passing through too," Catherine said after a while. He looked at her. She kept her eyes on the rain. "You do not have to," he said. "I know." She paused. "I did not have anywhere specific I was going. I just needed to go. My mother died. My father remarried, and the person I thought I was going to marry turned out to be someone whose idea of what I should be had nothing to do with who I actually am." She said it cleanly, without self-pity, but there was weight in it. "So I left." "The man," Seth said carefully, "was he unkind to you?" "He was not cruel," she said. "He was simply certain he knew better than me what kind of life I should want, and he was confident enough in that certainty that he stopped listening to anything I said that contradicted it." She glanced at him. "That kind of dismissal is its own form of unkindness, I think." "I think so too," Seth said. She looked at him fully then in the gray light of the storm, with the rain loud around them and the smell of wet earth rising from the street. She looked at him the way she had been avoiding looking at him for the past 6 weeks, which was directly and without the protective layer of careful composure she kept between herself and things that might matter to her. "You have never done that," she said. "Told me what I should want or who I should be." "No," he agreed. "Why?" He thought about this, not for show but genuinely. "Because it would not be accurate," he said finally. "You are the one who knows those things. I am just trying to be worth knowing." The thunder rolled across the plains again, distant now, moving east. The rain did not lighten. Catherine reached out and very deliberately took his hand, which was large and warm and slightly rough with work, and held it while the storm spent itself around them. He did not say anything. He closed his hand around hers and stood beside her, and that was more than enough. The following Sunday, Seth invited her to ride out to the ranch. He said it the way he said most things, directly and without adornment, over the fence between the boarding house yard and the road, where she had been sitting reading in the cooler morning air after the storm had finally passed and left the world clean. "My sister Ruth and her husband Charlie are coming for dinner," he said. "Mrs. Torres, who cooks for us, is making enough food for 12 people, which is her standard approach to cooking. I would like you to come if you are willing." "Why?" she asked, not suspiciously but genuinely. "Because I would like Ruth to meet you," he said, "and because I want to show you the place I come from. That is the honest answer." She said yes. He arrived at the boarding house with a horse for her, a gentle chestnut mare named Belle, who had the disposition of something that had been made entirely of patience. Catherine had ridden enough in Virginia to manage competently, and she was grateful for a horse that would not test her. They rode east out of town in the early morning, and the flat country slowly gave way to something with more texture: low, rolling hills and stretches of mesquite, and then the wide valley where the Atkins ranch sat with the creek running along its southern edge glinting in the morning light. The ranch was not grand in the architectural sense, but it had the particular beauty of things built to last rather than to impress. The main house was solid stone and timber, with a long porch that ran the full length of the front, and there were several outbuildings: the barn, the bunkhouse for the hands, a smokehouse, a chicken coop, and a kitchen garden that Catherine could see was well tended and serious about what it grew. Ruth Dunning was a smaller, brighter version of her brother, with the same amber eyes but more readiness to deploy them in the service of a teasing expression. She was 18, just barely married, and visibly happy in the uncomplicated way of someone who has gotten what they most wanted from life so far. Charlie Dunning was a solid, quiet young man with a handshake like a timber press, and an obvious adoration of his wife that manifested in small attentions: the way he made sure she had what she needed before he sat, the way he listened when she spoke. Ruth took Catherine's hand at the introduction and held it a beat longer than a handshake required, looking at her with assessment that was warm rather than competitive. "Seth told me you came in on the stage and told everyone you were just passing through," Ruth said, with barely suppressed delight. "And he said he told you he would bet against that." "He did," Catherine confirmed, glancing at Seth, who was suddenly very interested in hanging up his hat. "He tells everyone that story," Ruth said. "He has told it approximately 4 times that I know of. He never bets against anything unless he is absolutely certain." "Is that true?" Catherine asked him. "Ruth," Seth said in a tone that conveyed a complicated sibling history. "Is it or is it not?" Ruth insisted, grinning. "It is approximately true," Seth said, and went to help Charlie with the horses, which ended the conversation but not the implication. Dinner was everything Mrs. Torres had promised and more. There was stewed beef and roasted corn and fresh bread, and a soup so good that Catherine asked for the recipe, which Mrs. Torres gave her with visible pleasure, and a detailed set of instructions that Catherine suspected were slightly different from what Mrs. Torres actually did, because the best cook she had ever known always held something back. After dinner, Ruth and Charlie walked along the creek, which they did the way young people do when they want to be alone but would rather appear to be taking the air. Seth and Catherine sat on the front porch in the long summer evening, watching the light change over the hills. "This is a beautiful place," Catherine said. "It is," he agreed. "I have never wanted to be anywhere else, not even when I was young enough that it was fashionable to want things that were far away." He paused. "Does that seem small to you, wanting to stay in one place?" She thought about it carefully. 3 months ago it might have. I thought ambition looked like movement, like constant forward motion. She looked out at the valley. But I think I was confusing restlessness with purpose. They feel similar when you are in them, but they are very different things. He was watching her profile when she turned back to him, and he did not look away. "Catherine," he said, and there was something different in the way he said her name, something deliberate and gentle. "Seth," she said, which was also deliberate. "I would like to court you, if you are willing, if you would consider the possibility of staying in Harlow Creek long enough to find out what that could become." He said it seriously, with a gravity that matched the weight of what it meant. "I do not want to rush you. I know you came here with things you were still working out. I just want you to know my intentions are honest." She was quiet for a moment. The evening light was golden and slow, and from the creek she could hear Ruth laughing at something Charlie had said. "Yes," she said, "I am willing to consider it." He smiled then, the wide one that was different from his usual composed expressions, the one that made him look like someone who had just received very good news. "I told you I was going to win that bet," he said. "You have not won anything yet," she said firmly, but she was smiling too. Courting in a small Texas town in 1879 was a particular kind of thing. It was attended, noted, and assessed by the entire community with a thoroughness that left little to privacy, and Catherine found this by turns charming and exhausting. Mrs. Hensley had thoughts. Hank Garfield at the general store had thoughts, which he expressed by putting a small vase of wildflowers on her desk every Monday morning without explanation. Even old Pete Norris outside the barbershop had thoughts, delivered in a series of approving nods that increased in enthusiasm as the weeks went on. Seth navigated all of it with the same unhurried steadiness he brought to everything else. He came to escort her to church on Sundays, which was a formal enough declaration in Harlow Creek to require no further announcement. He brought her things from the ranch, not as gifts exactly, but as shares fresh eggs from the hens, early tomatoes from Mrs. Torr's garden, a jar of honey from the hives that one of his hands, a quiet young man named Miguel, kept near the creek. He never missed a promise or forgot something she had mentioned in passing. He also argued with her, which she found more reassuring than anything else. In September, she had a dispute with the school board about curriculum, specifically about whether she should be required to stop teaching the Walker children alongside the white children, which one member of the board, a sour-faced rancher named Walter Hicks, insisted was creating complications. She went to the meeting prepared to argue her position and was told by Hicks that she should discuss it with her husband before making such decisions, since presumably her husband would have a more settled view. She did not have a husband, she replied, which meant the decision was entirely her own, and the Walker children would remain in her school. She said it calmly and absolutely, and Hicks backed down, partly because 3 other board members had no appetite for the fight, and partly because Reverend Dalton, who ran the board, was a better man than Hicks and knew it. That evening she told Seth about it over supper at the boarding house, where Mrs. Hensley had taken to including him at table with the practicality of a woman who understood which way things were going. She told him the whole of it, including what Hicks had said about consulting a husband. "What did you think about that?" he asked. "I think it is a perfect example of the kind of thinking that has made my life difficult since I was old enough to have opinions," she said. "I do not consult anyone before making decisions about my classroom." "I know," he said. "I also know that I would have said the same thing you said, had I been there, which is that James and Clara Walker are your students, and that is the end of the argument." He looked at her steadily. "I am not interested in telling you how to run your school, Catherine. I am interested in knowing what happened in your day because it matters to you and therefore it matters to me. There is a difference." She looked at him for a long moment. "I know," she said softly. "I do know that. I was not accusing you." "I know you were not," he said. "I just wanted it said plainly." She reached across the table and put her hand on top of his, which was apparently enough to make Mrs. Hensley find a very pressing need to go check something in the kitchen. October came with a coolness that was a mercy after the summer, and with it came a complication that Catherine had been dimly aware was possible, but had not planned for in any practical way. A letter arrived for her from Richmond. It was from her father. He had written, in his careful, slightly formal hand, that her stepmother Harriet was unwell, that things at home had become difficult, and that he wondered if Catherine might consider returning to help manage the household for a time. He added, in a paragraph that managed to communicate both guilt and expectation in equal measure, that he was sure she had enjoyed her adventure out west, but that family obligations, when all was said and done, were family obligations. She read it twice on the bench outside the post office, and then sat with it for a long time. Seth found her there because he had a particular instinct for knowing when she was somewhere in the town and needing to not be alone, and he sat beside her without comment for a moment before she handed him the letter. He read it and handed it back. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I am thinking that I spent most of my life managing things for my family," she said. "My mother's illness, the house after she died, and now my father wants me to go back and do it again, and I am trying to work out whether I feel obligated to go or whether I feel obligated to stay." "What would you go back to, practically speaking?" he asked. "If you went." "A sick woman I do not know very well and a father who loves me in the incomplete way of someone who has never quite understood that I was a separate person from his idea of me." She folded the letter. "And I would leave here, leave the school, leave everything I have been building." She paused. "Leave you." He was quiet for a moment. "I cannot tell you what to decide," he said. "That is yours. But I want you to know that what is here is not going anywhere. I'm not going anywhere. And if you were to decide to go back, I would wait for you to decide to come back because I am fairly certain you would." He said it without pressure. "I believe that, Catherine. I believe this is where you are supposed to be." She looked at him with something full and complicated behind her eyes. "You are the most infuriating man," she said, "because you are always so calm and I cannot find anything wrong with what you say." "Is that a problem?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "It makes it very hard to argue." "Then do not argue," he said. "Just think about it." She wrote back to her father. She wrote it honestly and with more kindness than she had given him credit for deserving, because she was trying, as she grew older, to be fair about the people in her life rather than simply angry at them. She told him that she loved him. She told him she was sorry Harriet was unwell and that she hoped for her recovery. She told him that she had a life in Texas that was real and growing and that she could not leave it. She told him that she hoped he would understand, and if he could not, she hoped he would find his way to it eventually. She sealed the letter and mailed it and felt, when she walked away from the post office, lighter than she had felt in years. The night she mailed the letter, Seth asked her to take a walk out to the edge of town where the road curved south, and you could see the stars more clearly without the lantern light interfering. The sky in West Texas in October was something that could stop your breath if you let it, so deep and so crowded with stars that it looked like something impossible, like a painting of an idea rather than a fact. They stood looking up at it for a while, and then Seth said, not looking at the stars anymore but looking at her, "I love you, Catherine. I want to say it plainly because I have been thinking it for some time, and it seems wrong to hold it back any longer." She turned to him. He was looking at her with everything present in his expression, nothing held in reserve, which was both the bravest thing she had ever seen anyone do and the most terrifying because it asked her to match it. She had been afraid of this. Not of him, but of the weight of it, the way love in her experience had always come with conditions attached, with expectations she had not agreed to, with versions of herself she was required to become. She had been afraid that if she let herself feel it fully, she would find out that this, too, was something that would try to make her smaller. But she looked at Seth Atkins in the starlight and understood that she had been confusing the container with the thing itself. She had been so focused on what love had done wrong to her before that she had not fully recognized what it looked like when it was done right, which was exactly this steady, patient, respectful thing that he had been offering her since the first moment without requiring anything back. "I love you too," she said, and her voice was clear and certain. "I have for a while. I was just being careful." "You are allowed to be careful," he said. "I know," she said, "but I am done being afraid of it." She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, and he leaned into it slightly. And then he kissed her, which was as unhurried and certain as everything else about him. And the Texas stars swung overhead like something that had been waiting for this particular moment to look its best. Winter settled over Harlow Creek with the characteristic mildness of a Texas December, cooler than most places would call winter, but cold enough at night to make the fireplaces in the boarding house click and glow. Catherine had by now fully absorbed herself into the life of the town, in a way she could no longer have explained as temporary even if she had tried. She knew every family by name. She knew which students had trouble at home and which ones needed encouragement and which ones needed challenge. She knew that Hank Garfield's books, while now impeccably organized, still reflected his tendency to undercharge people he liked, which was most people, which meant his margins were always thinner than they should have been. She also knew that she was going to marry Seth Atkins. She knew it the way she knew things that were true rather than things she merely hoped for, which was a distinction she had learned to take seriously. He proposed in January on the front porch of the ranch house, which had become in the months of their courtship her second home in the way that places become yours through accumulated time and comfort. He had planned it, she could tell, because there were wildflowers she suspected he had convinced Mrs. Torres to preserve somehow, and the porch had been swept with unusual thoroughness. But the proposal itself was him, plain and earnest and completely without theatrical flourish. He told her he could not imagine the ranch without her voice in it, and her mind, and her particular laugh that she saved for things that actually deserved it. He told her he wanted to build a life alongside her, not ahead of her or behind her, or in front of telling her what direction to go, but alongside, which was the only arrangement that made sense to him. He told her he had a ring that had belonged to his mother, a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone that his father had brought from New Mexico, and he wanted her to wear it if she would have him. She said yes with a steadiness that matched his, and when he put the ring on her finger it fit as though it had been waiting. The wedding was on the 15th of March, 1880, 1 year and a handful of days after Catherine Bristol had stepped off a stagecoach in Harlow Creek and told everyone she was just passing through. The whole town came. This was not hyperbole. Every man, woman, and child in Harlow Creek was at that church, including old Pete Norris, who had apparently been saving a good shirt for a significant occasion and had decided this qualified. Ruth was Catherine's attendant, round now with her first pregnancy and incandescent with happiness on her sister-in-law's behalf. Mrs. Hensley sat in the front pew and cried with the quiet dignity of a woman who felt things deeply, but would not give them more space than they deserved. Reverend Dalton conducted the ceremony with appropriate solemnity and a warmth that suggested he was personally invested in the outcome. Joseph Walker sat with his family in the third row, and his son James, who had grown 3 inches in the past several months and was now thoroughly the best student in the school, wore an expression of careful pride that made Catherine think he understood, somehow, what this moment meant beyond the immediate occasion of it. Dolores Vega from the Red Rock had brought flowers, extravagant ones, more than the church strictly needed, but nobody objected. Seth stood at the altar in a suit that was clearly not something he wore often, but that he wore well, and he watched her walk toward him with the focused attention of a man who is committing something to permanent memory. When she reached him, he took her hands and held them with the same certainty he always had, and they said the words that meant they were choosing each other, formally and in front of everyone, and the fiddle player Caleb played something sweet and clear when it was done. At the reception, which was held in the church hall, and which involved more food than any celebration strictly required, Seth stood up and said several things, not all of which were planned. He thanked the town for making Catherine feel welcome, which produced some laughter, because he also acknowledged that the town had been watching their courtship with the focused attention of people who had nothing more pressing to do. He thanked Ruth and Charlie for coming in from their place on the south side of town, which was now crowded with the imminent arrival of a new Dunning. He thanked Mrs. Hensley for feeding him at her table and for never once mentioning that he was eating there more than he was paying for. Then he looked at Catherine and said, quietly enough that most of the room leaned in without meaning to, "I told you I was going to win that bet. I told you from the very first day that you were not just passing through. And I want you to know that whatever I bet against, whatever odds I was working with, I would have bet everything on you. Every single time." The room was quiet for a moment, and then someone began to applaud, and it spread through the church hall the way warmth spreads through a house when the fire is going well. Catherine looked at her husband and thought, with a clarity that felt like it had been building since the moment she stepped off that stagecoach, that she had not actually been passing through Harlow Creek at all. She had been arriving. She had just not known it yet. Spring moved through the ranch with the productive energy of a season that meant business. Catherine was teaching still, because she had made clear before the wedding that she intended to continue teaching, and Seth had been entirely supportive of this in a way that surprised precisely nobody who knew him. She kept the school running, kept Hank Garfield's books in order, and had also taken on managing the ranch's accounts, which had been kept in a manner that made Hank's old system look like a marvel of modern efficiency. Ruth had her baby in April, a son she named James, after Seth and Ruth's father, and the whole Dunning and Atkins family descended on the small house on the south side of town and was noisy with joy about it. Catherine held the baby and felt something she had not expected, which was a longing that was patient rather than urgent, a sense of waiting for a time that was coming. The Atkins ranch was busy in the spring with calving season, which meant Seth was often out before dawn and back after dark, and Catherine learned the rhythms of ranch life in a practical rather than romantic way, which was to say she understood that it was beautiful but also demanding, and she made it her business to understand the business of it, the markets and the prices, and the railroad contracts that were changing the cattle trade as the decade moved forward. She was useful to him in this, and he knew it, and the kind of partnership they were building was grounded and specific and real. One afternoon in May, Seth came back from the southern pasture looking thoughtful in a way she had learned to notice, the kind of thought that meant something was turning over in his mind. "What is it?" she asked, when he had washed and sat down at the kitchen table where she was writing up the week's ledger entries. "The railroad is coming through," he said. "I heard it confirmed in town today. The Texas and Pacific is going to lay tracks 12 miles south of here. That changes things significantly for cattle movement. We could triple our output if we expanded the herd now before prices adjust." She looked up from the ledger. "What would expansion require?" "More land. There are 3 homestead claims east of us that I know of where the families have struggled with this last dry winter. They might sell, or they might welcome a grazing lease arrangement. And I would need to hire 2 more hands." He looked at her. "What do you think?" She considered it. "Lease before purchase if they are willing. It shows good faith and it keeps your capital liquid while you build the herd. Do the expansion incrementally, not all at once. And for the new hands, talk to Joseph Walker about whether he knows good men who need work. He vouches for people well." Seth looked at her for a moment with an expression she had come to recognize as the one he wore when he was happily surprised, even though he kept telling himself he should not be surprised at all. "That is exactly what I was thinking," he said. "Well," she said, turning back to the ledger with a small smile, "we think alike." "We do," he said, and leaned over and kissed her temple before going to see to his horse. Summer of 1880 was full and productive, and long in the way that good seasons are, where each day has weight to it, but it is a good weight. The ranch expanded exactly as they had planned. Seth hired 2 new hands, one of whom Joseph Walker had indeed recommended, a young man from Mexico named Ernesto, who was an extraordinary horseman, and who spoke English with a precision that suggested he had worked very hard at it, which Seth and Catherine both respected. The herd grew steadily, and Catherine watched the accounts shift from careful management into genuine growth. She found out she was expecting a child in August, confirmed by old Dr. Prout, who announced it with the same matter-of-fact tone he used for all medical information, as if the arrival of a new person into the world were a thing you could plan adequately if you just listened carefully to the instructions. Seth received the news in the kitchen of the ranch house after evening supper, and his face did something she had never seen it do before, which was go briefly and completely unguarded, open in a way that had nothing to do with composure or steadiness, just raw feeling, uncomplicated and enormous. "A baby," he said, like a man trying out the word for the first time. Dr. Prout believes March, she said. He is not precise about these things, but March seems likely. Seth crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and took her in his arms with a gentleness that was different from his usual careful manner, as if she were something precious that he was trying not to tip. She laughed at the quality of it and pulled back enough to look at him. "I am not fragile," she said. "I know," he said. "I am." She laughed again and put her arms around his neck, and he held her properly then, and outside the ranch house the Texas evening moved into dark with the quiet authority of a thing that had been doing this for a very long time and had no plans to stop. She told the school board about her condition in September and made it clear that she intended to continue teaching until she was physically unable and to return after the birth, which was not a thing women in her position typically said to school boards in 1879. Walter Hicks looked as though he had opinions about this, but Reverend Dalton spoke before Hicks could, saying that Miss Bristol, who was of course now Mrs. Atkins, had made the school the best it had been in a decade, and the board would be fortunate to accommodate any arrangement she proposed. She had Ruth helping with the school in the months when she became too uncomfortable to manage the full day alone. Ruth, who was herself adapting to motherhood with the same bright energy she brought to everything, came in 2 afternoons a week and managed the younger children with instinctive warmth. It was a good arrangement, and it grew into something that would eventually become permanent, though neither of them knew that yet. The winter of 1880 was mild and careful. Catherine spent the evenings by the fireplace in the ranch house with Seth beside her, and they read to each other, which had become their ritual, taking turns with whatever book was at hand. She read him the history of Texas settlement that she had ordered from the bookshop in Fort Worth. He read her a novel that Mrs. Hensley had passed along, which was a melodramatic thing full of mistaken identities and dramatic reunions, and Seth read it so seriously and without irony that it became funnier with each chapter. The neighbors came to call regularly. Mrs. Torres presided over the kitchen with the authority of someone who considered the ranch house her domain, and who had accepted Catherine into this domain with a generosity that Catherine had not taken for granted. She had learned to cook beside her, truly cook, in the way you learn from someone who measures with their hands and their eyes and their experience rather than from any written instruction. Her son was born on the 4th of March, 1881, in the ranch house in a room warmed by 2 fires against the late winter cold. It was a long labor, and by the end of it Catherine had decided several things about the nature of strength and endurance that she supposed she had known theoretically but now knew in her bones. Mrs. Torres was there, and the doctor, and Ruth, who held Catherine's hand and said things that were encouraging and sometimes inaccurate, but always said with absolute conviction. Seth waited in the kitchen with Charlie and Joseph Walker, who had come because Joseph had ridden in from the south pasture when he heard the news and nobody had told him to go home, and he hadn't left. When the baby's cry came, clear and strong and absolutely certain of itself, Seth stood up from his chair and stood very still for a moment, and Joseph Walker reached over and put a hand on his shoulder without saying anything, which was exactly the right thing. They named the boy James Thomas Atkins, James for Seth's father and Thomas for no one in particular, but because it sounded right, and Catherine laid him in Seth's arms 20 minutes after he came into the world and watched her husband look at his son with an expression that she would carry in her memory for the rest of her life. "Hello," Seth said to the baby, very quietly. Just that. Just hello. Harlow Creek had the kind of spring that seemed to agree with everything. The town had grown again over the winter, 3 new families arriving along the newly extended cattle road, and there was talk of a telegraph office and a second general store. Catherine went back to teaching in May, leaving James in the careful supervision of Mrs. Torres during school hours, who took on this responsibility with the focused energy of someone who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. The school now had 20 students, and Catherine had arranged it into two groups that she taught in shifts, the older students in the morning and the younger ones in the afternoon, with Ruth taking the afternoon session on Tuesdays and Thursdays. The Walker children were both thriving. Clara Walker, who was now 14 and bright enough to be frightening, had begun helping with the younger children herself, and Catherine was already thinking about how to help her find a path to further education, because Clara deserved one and the world was going to require some persuading to provide it. But Catherine had been persuading the world of things for years and was not put off by the project. Seth expanded the ranch again that spring, not dramatically but steadily, which was the way he did things. The railroad connection to the south had done everything he had expected it to, and the Atkins ranch had a contract now with a buyer in Fort Worth that was solid and regular, and made the books look the way books should look. Catherine managed the finances with the satisfaction of someone doing work they were genuinely suited for, and they had begun to talk about what the ranch could become over the next 10 years, the way people talk about the future when they are genuinely in it together. She was standing in the doorway of the barn one June evening, watching Seth work with a young horse that had been giving trouble, talking to it in the low, patient voice he used for animals, and sometimes for students that Ruth brought over who were nervous. The horse settled under his hands, and Catherine watched the whole process with the quiet pleasure of watching someone excellent at what they do, which was its own particular kind of beauty. He looked up and found her there, and something passed between them in the evening light that needed no words, the simple recognition of two people who had chosen each other and found the choice to be continuously, daily, specifically correct. He came out of the barn and walked to where she was standing, and she reached up to push his hair back from his forehead, which had gotten longer than he usually kept it because the last months had been busy and he had not gotten around to the barber. "You need a haircut," she said. "I know," he said. "Pete Norris told me this morning, in some detail. Pete Norris is right." "He usually is," Seth agreed, and caught her hand and held it against his face for a moment, turning his head slightly to press his lips against her palm, which was something he did when words were not the right instrument for what he felt. She thought about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach a year and 3 months ago with a single leather bag and a carefully maintained distance from everything that might become permanent. That woman had been brave in her way, and she had been right to leave what she had left, but she had also been wrong about one important thing, which was that staying was a lesser form of courage than leaving. It was not. It was simply a different one. The summer of 1880, one moved through Harlow Creek with the productive warmth of a season that had decided to be generous. Little James learned to roll over and then to sit, and then to pull himself upright against anything that would hold him, which at the ranch included Mrs. Torr's apron strings, the leg of the kitchen table, and most entertainingly, the patient old barn cat who submitted to being used as a fulcrum with the dignity of an elder statesman. Seth's sister Ruth had been offered a part-time teaching salary by the school board, formalizing the arrangement that had grown naturally over the preceding months, and she accepted it with enthusiasm, and immediately began reorganizing the afternoon curriculum with a creative energy that complemented Catherine's more structured approach, in ways that both of them found mutually improving. Charlie Dunning continued to farm his land with the methodical persistence of someone who did not have great flair but had great patience, and his patience was paying off in crops that were steady and good. In September, Catherine had a conversation with Joseph Walker that had been coming for some time. She had spoken to Reverend Dalton about Clara Walker's situation, and Dalton had made inquiries through his church network about schools and teachers' colleges in Texas that might accept a student of Clara's ability, regardless of the additional barriers she would face. The news was not simple. The world in 1881 was not a place that made things straightforward for a young black woman from a small Texas town seeking an education. But it was not hopeless either, and Catherine laid out what she had found for Joseph Walker and his wife, Ida, at the kitchen table of their house on the west side of town. Ida Walker was a compact woman with watchful eyes and hands that were never quite still, and she listened to everything Catherine said with the complete attention of someone who has learned to distinguish between people who mean what they say and people who do not. "There is a school in Austin connected to the Freedmen's Bureau network," Catherine said. "It is not without its difficulties, but it takes serious students, and Clara is the most serious student I have ever taught. How would we manage it?" Joseph asked. "The cost, the distance. I have spoken to Seth. He is willing to offer a loan against future consideration that is entirely without condition and interest-free because he believes in this as much as I do." She said it plainly and did not soften it. "You may repay it whenever you can. You may never be able to repay it, and we will not hold that over you. But we want Clara to have this if you and she want it." Ida Walker looked at Catherine for a long moment. "Why?" she asked, and it was not a suspicious question. It was the question of a woman who needed to understand the full truth of something before she accepted it. "Because she deserves it," Catherine said. "And because the world does not give things to people who deserve them as often as it should, and wherever I can do something about that, I am going to." She paused. "My mother believed in me when most people did not. Someone helped her believe in herself first. These things pass forward. That is all." Ida Walker reached across the table and pressed Catherine's hand briefly and nodded. Clara Walker left for Austin in October 1882, at 14 years old, which was old enough for what was ahead of her. Her brother James, now 11 and still the sharpest student in the school, watched her go with a pride that was enormous and a missing that was equally large. Catherine promised to continue writing to Clara and to find what resources she could to support her, and she kept this promise with the same consistency she brought to everything else. The winter of 1882 was the kind that made stories. A blue norther came down from the Panhandle in December and held the county in a grip of cold that was unusual even by the standards of people who knew Texas cold. The cattle needed extra management, and several days on the ranch were entirely consumed by keeping the herd safe, which meant Seth and his hands were working from before light to after dark, and Catherine managed the house and the baby and Mrs. Tours and the correspondence and the supply records all at once, and found that she was more than capable of it. On the worst night of the freeze, she sat in the kitchen with Mrs. Tours and little James, who was almost 2 and had opinions about everything, and outside the wind was something alive and insistent. Seth had been out with the herd since before dawn and had come in once briefly at noon for coffee and to warm his hands, and then gone back out. He came home at 9 in the evening, frozen through and exhausted in the particular way that is animal rather than ordinary tiredness, and she sat him by the fire and brought him the soup Mrs. Tours had ready and kept ready and pulled off his ice-stiffened gloves and held his hands between hers, rubbing warmth back into them steadily. He looked at her from behind the curtain of his exhaustion with an expression so full of gratitude and love and simple relief at being home that she had to look away for a moment because it was too much to look at directly. "All the cattle?" she asked. "Lost 7, he said. "Could have been worse." "Much worse," she agreed. "Drink the soup." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and there was a laugh in his voice even through the tiredness, and she smiled at the table in front of her. Spring came back as it always does. By 1883, the ranch had settled into a rhythm that was both productive and, Catherine thought, genuinely beautiful. The herd was strong, the accounts were healthy, the land was good. She was still teaching, though she had reduced her hours to accommodate the pace of ranch life and the fact that James, now 2 and running with the full commitment of something that had never considered walking sufficient, required considerable attention. She found out she was expecting again in the spring of 1883, and told Seth in the kitchen after supper, while James sat in the high chair and worked with solemn concentration on a piece of bread. Seth set down his coffee cup very deliberately and looked at her with a smile that started slowly and grew, March again, he asked. November, Dr. Prout thinks. He remains imprecise, but November. A summer baby, Seth said, with the thoughtfulness of a rancher automatically considering the season's demands. Then he looked at James, who had finished the bread and was now investigating whether the high chair tray could be detached through applied persistence, and then back at Catherine, and the smile settled into something warm and permanent. Good, he said simply. That is very good. Their daughter was born on a warm evening in early November, 1883, and they named her Alice Me Atkins. Alice for no reason either of them could quite explain except that it suited her, and Me for Seth's mother, whose name Catherine had asked about one evening and quietly stored away. Alice was a different proposition from James entirely. Where James had announced himself with volume and continued to fill space with energy, Alice arrived with a watchful calm that did not suggest passivity but rather assessment, as if she were taking inventory of what she had been born into and considering her options. She looked at things with the focused attention of someone who intended to understand them, and she looked at her brother. When James first peered into her cradle with his mixture of curiosity and mild suspicion, with an expression that Catherine was fairly certain communicated that she was not impressed by his seniority. James had been uncertain about the idea of a sibling in the theoretical phase. In the practical phase, holding his sister for the first time with Seth's hands carefully supporting his arms, he looked down at Alice with an expression that Catherine recognized as love happening in real time, and he said, very seriously, "She is very small." "You were too," Seth told him. James looked doubtful about this but did not argue. The years after Alice's arrival were full in the way that good lives are full, with the weight of real days rather than the weight of waiting for real days. Harlow Creek continued to grow. The telegraph came in 1884, which changed the pace of information arriving in the town, and with it the sense of how connected the place was to everything that lay beyond its borders. The school grew to 28 students by 1885, and Ruth was now effectively co-running it with Catherine, and the two of them had such complementary methods that the school had a reputation in the county that was beginning to attract families specifically because of it. James Atkins turned 5 in the spring of 1886 and started school the following September in his mother's classroom, which was a situation that required some careful navigation on both sides. Catherine was scrupulously fair with him, which meant he received no particular consideration and possibly slightly more rigorous expectation, which was, she reasoned, the appropriate response to having a son who was already reading well before the school year started, and who had demonstrated a mathematical instinct that was recognizable even in a 5-year-old. Seth, when she explained her reasoning, agreed without hesitation. Alice, not yet 3, watched James leave for school on the first morning with an expression that suggested she was already calculating how long she would have to wait. Seth had expanded the ranch twice more by 1886, managing growth with the same steady, methodical approach that characterized everything he did. He had 3 permanent hands now, including Ernesto, who had been with them since the first expansion and who had in the intervening years become something between an employee and family, which Ernesto appeared to find simultaneously gratifying and mildly embarrassing. Joseph Walker was still the best hand Seth had, and Joseph's son James, who was now 15, worked summers on the ranch with a capability that was already beyond his years. Catherine ran the books, the school, and a considerable portion of the correspondence that connected the ranch to its buyers and suppliers, and she had found in the years since her arrival something she had not known she was looking for, which was the particular satisfaction of a life that was large in proportion to itself, not grand or famous or extraordinary, but full and purposeful in hers. She had made it herself, with Seth beside her, not behind her or in front of her telling her which direction to go. She thought about this sometimes in the evenings, after James and Alice were settled and Seth was reading by the fire, and the house was quiet with the specific quiet of people who are comfortable with each other. She thought about the woman who had arrived in Harlow Creek with one bag and a carefully held conviction that she was not going to stay. She thought about Seth Atkins leaning against that post with his arms folded and his easy confidence, saying he would bet against that. She had resented it at the time. She had been wrong to resent it, though she could understand why she had. He had not been trying to tell her what to do or who to be. He had simply seen something she was still learning to see herself, which was that she had arrived somewhere, and that arriving was not the same thing as being trapped. One evening in October of 1886, with the weather turning and the house warm with the first fire of the season, and James asleep upstairs and Alice in her small bed in the adjoining room, and the ranch outside quiet under an early frost, Catherine said, "You know, I owe you a concession." Seth looked up from the papers he had been reviewing, Cattlemen's Association notices, a thing that had become more organized as the decade progressed. "What concession?" "About the bet," she said. "You won. I should have said so formally." He put down the papers and looked at her with that amber gaze that still, after 7 years of marriage, had not lost its quality of seeing things precisely. "You have said it in 100 different ways," he said. "Not formally," she said. "You said on the first day that you would bet against me just passing through, and you were right, and I want to say it plainly so it is on the record." "The record," he said, amused. "What record?" "The record of important truths," she said, which made him smile. "All right," he said, "say it plainly then." She looked at him across the warm room, this man who had been patient and steady and honest, and who had never once, in 7 years of the most intimate and daily proximity, tried to make her into something other than what she was. This man who had held her hands in a storm and told her about his father and ridden alongside her through the Texas seasons, and held her son the first moment of his life and said hello. This man who was her partner and her friend and the person she would choose over and over, if choosing were something you were given the opportunity to do again. "I was not just passing through," she said. "I was arriving. You saw that before I did, and you were entirely right, and I concede the bet without reservation." Seth got up from his chair, crossed the room, and sat beside her on the settee, taking her hand in the easy way they did everything by now, which was without ceremony but with full intention. "You know what I actually bet," he said. "What?" "I bet that you were someone worth knowing well. That was the whole bet. The rest was just the occasion for saying it." She leaned against his shoulder and he put his arm around her. And outside the Texas night was old and wide and full of stars. And the house held them with the particular warmth of a place that has been genuinely lived in, that has absorbed a marriage and arguments and laughter and children and grief and work and love, all the material of a real life, worn into the walls and the floors and the very air of the rooms. "We should get another chair for the parlor," she said, after a while. "James is going to be too big for the small ones before long. I will ask Ernesto to look at the wood," Seth said. "He has been wanting to try his hand at furniture." "Good," she said. "And we should think about the spring planting in the kitchen garden. Mrs. Torres wants to expand it." "She is right. More tomatoes." "Definitely more tomatoes," Catherine agreed. They sat for a while longer in the firelight, talking about the ordinary things that were the fabric of their life, the ranch and the school and the children and the plans for next season. The fire burned low and comfortable, and outside Harlow Creek was quiet under the October stars. In the spring of 1887, Clara Walker came home from Austin for a visit. She was 19 now, a composed and remarkable young woman who had completed her first year of formal teacher training, and had the quality of someone who has tested themselves against harder things and come through with more capability than they started with. She sat in the school one afternoon while Catherine taught and watched with an expression of close attention. Afterward, over coffee at the ranch house, she told Catherine that she intended to return to Austin for her second year, and then to find a position teaching in a school that needed what she had to offer. Catherine told her about a school in San Antonio she had recently heard of through Reverend Dalton's network that served a community that was growing and where a teacher of Clara's caliber would be both welcomed and necessary. "I want to do what you did," Clara said. "What did I do?" Catherine asked. "You saw what someone could become and you made space for it," Clara said. "That is what I want to do." Catherine thought about this. "That is a good ambition," she said simply. "It will not always be easy." "I know," Clara said. "I have known that for a long time." Catherine reached across the table and put her hand briefly on Clara's. "Then you will be very good at it," she said. Clara Walker returned to Austin and to the life she was building, and Catherine followed her progress through letters that arrived every few weeks, full of careful observation and specific detail, which made her feel with every reading that she was watching something rare grow into its full height, and was glad to have had any part of it. James Atkins, at 6 years old, had developed 3 primary interests: horses, numbers, and taking things apart to see how they worked. The last of these had been responsible for the disassembly of a clock, 2 locks, and Seth's good compass before the household had developed a protocol of keeping mechanisms above the height of his reach, which was a measure that required constant revision as he grew. Seth took this with remarkable patience, largely because he recognized in his son's curiosity something he valued in other people, which was the genuine desire to understand how things functioned. Alice, at 3, watched her brother with the strategic attention of someone filing information for future use. She was less interested in mechanisms and more interested in the words for things, and she had taken to asking for the name of every object she encountered, with a thoroughness that had led Catherine to realize that naming was how Alice organized the world, that language was her instrument for understanding, and that this was a gift that would need cultivation. By the time Alice was 4, she had memorized most of the shorter poems in the anthology Catherine used for school, which she recited with a delivery that was serious and slightly dramatic and thoroughly charming. Seth would listen to her recitations on the porch with the focused attention he gave to things that deserved it, and Alice, sensing an excellent audience, always concluded her performances by looking at him for assessment. "Again," she would ask each time. "Again," he would say each time and mean it. The spring of 1888, Texas was in the midst of a period of change that was visible even from Harlow Creek. The cattle drives of the trail era were giving way to the railroad era, which was cleaner but less romantic, and the range itself was beginning to be divided by barbed wire, as homesteaders and ranchers established their claims with increasing permanence. Seth had already fenced his property wisely, working with his neighbors rather than against them, and had the advantages of several additional contracts through the railway system that his father would not have believed possible in 1852. The town had a real bank now, which Catherine had been instrumental in establishing, not as a founder but as the person who had drafted the initial economic case and presented it to the county commissioners with such clarity that even the skeptics had found it difficult to argue against. The bank gave the town a stability it had lacked, and it gave the farmers and ranchers of the surrounding area access to credit that was not purely dependent on the goodwill of distant institutions. Hank Garfield, whose books Catherine still managed, and who was still charging people he liked less than he should, had remarried a woman named Marguerite who had come to Harlow Creek with a family visiting from San Antonio and had simply stayed, which was something Catherine found quietly satisfying. Marguerite was sharp and funny and had strong opinions about inventory management, and Catherine liked her enormously. On an evening in early June of 1888, the whole of their world gathered on the porch of the Atkins ranch house without particular ceremony or plan. It was a Sunday after church, and Ruth and Charlie had come out with their son James, who was 7 and had his father's steadiness and his mother's eyes. Joseph Walker was there because he had come to discuss some pasture matters with Seth and had been invited to stay, and Ida Walker was there because Joseph was, and their son James was there, 17 now and serious about becoming a rancher of his own, already making plans. Mrs. Torres was there because she was always there, and it was her kitchen, and also she had made enough food to indicate she had expected company. Old Dr. Prout had come because Seth had invited him, and he had no good reason to decline, and possibly he was less ancient than he appeared because he had arrived on horseback without apparent difficulty. Catherine stood in the doorway watching all of it, the adults talking in clusters on the porch and in the yard, her son James at 7 already holding his own with the older Walker boy, asking questions with his father's directness. Alice at 4 sitting between Mrs. Torres and Ida Walker with the contentment of a child who has calculated that she is in the best position available. Seth in the yard talking to Joseph Walker about the south pasture fence with his hat pushed back, and his hands making the particular gestures he used when he was thinking through something practical. She thought about what she had been before Harlow Creek. She thought about the leather bag and the blue traveling dress and the way she had stood in the dust of the main street and declared with such certainty that she was just passing through. And she thought about Seth Atkins, 28 years old and sun-worn and unbothered, leaning against that post and saying with complete calm that he would bet against that. He had been right. He had been right from the first moment, not because he had known her particularly, but because he had recognized something she was still working out, which was that a person could be in the right place before they understood they had arrived. Seth looked across the yard and found her in the doorway, and the expression on his face was everything that the years had been between them, steady and warm and full of the specific knowledge that came from building something real together. He crossed the yard toward her because he always crossed whatever distance was between them without making it look like effort, and stopped on the step below her so their eyes were nearly level. "You look very serious," he said. "I was thinking," she said. "About what?" "About how right you were," she said, "on the first day about the bet." He tilted his head slightly the way he did when something caught his full attention. "Still thinking about that. It comes back to me sometimes," she said. "That day. The way I was. The things I thought I wanted, which were mostly the absence of things rather than the presence of them." She paused. "You saw something I did not." "No," he said gently. "I just waited for you to see it yourself. That is all I did." "You did more than that," she said. "Not much more," he said. "You did the rest." She reached out and took his hand, which was the first thing she had done that evening after the storm that had meant something definite. He closed his fingers around hers with the familiar certainty of a thing that had been done 1,000 times and was no less deliberate for the repetition. "Supper is ready." Mrs. Torres called from inside with the authority of someone who had managed this household's mealtimes for over a decade and was not going to wait for them. "We are coming," Catherine called back, and looked at Seth one more moment. "Come on then," he said, and she went inside with him into the house that was full of the people that mattered, into the evening that was warm and specific and real, into the life she had not known she was arriving at until a cowboy with amber eyes and a comfortable confidence had told her, on a dusty afternoon in Harlow Creek, that he would bet against her just passing through. He had been right about that. He had been right about all of it. And the years ahead were as wide as the Texas sky, and as full of possibility as the morning after a good rain, and Catherine Atkins, who had been Catherine Bristol and who had been a woman just passing through, was exactly where she had always been meant to arrive, with her son and her daughter and the school and the ranch and the work of a real life, and the man beside her who had seen her before she had seen herself, and who would stand beside her, unhurried and certain, for all the days that came.